Hi, I'm Michael Lang, and this is another series in the conversations I've called In Their Voices. And today I have a chance to talk to an old colleague, not as old as I am, but one I've known for a long time, John Stevens. Welcome, John. It's good to see you.
Very good to see you again, Michael. So I'll say a bit about where I am now and a little bit of history. So I'm happily ensconced at UNC at Chapel Hill, despite at this moment the COVID case spike on our campus. I'm healthy, as is my family. I teach and research and do consulting in the areas of mediation, facilitation, and collaborative problem solving for state and local government officials in North Carolina. I'm housed at an unusual part, at least in terms of our mission. The name is fairly unusual. We are a school of government, but while we do have one degree program, a Master's of Public Administration, the majority of the work of me and other faculty are not for students on campus, but people who are in jobs in various roles in state and local government and the North Carolina judiciary, and doing professional development with them, typically short-term projects and teaching, but also sometimes longer consulting projects. And our writing is both for a more expert audience, but even more so for a practice audience. So the neologism that I like to say is I'm not so much an academic as a prac-ademic, so focused on the practical aspects. I joined UNC and School of Government in 1996 to develop something called a public dispute resolution program. So not things in the courts, but things that would involve government agency in a neighborhood or outside group, or city, county, or city-state kind of things. So things that at least touch on government in one way or another. I'm very pleased to have had a chance to develop my skills through a PhD program at George Mason University. I was one of the earlier students when they started their PhD program back in 1989, and I focused on a large-scale social conflict within the United Methodist Church as a denomination. I wanted to look at deep-rooted values conflict, and so I looked at tensions within the denomination on gay and lesbian values and the standards of the church. And that led into me doing consulting projects to have those kinds of dialogues with different arms of the United Methodist Church. Long time ago, and I have to hasten to add, at this moment, they are in the process of a formal separation. The more conservative and more liberals said, we can't live together on this issue. They are going to go their separate ways. Through the School of Government, I get called on to be a facilitator or a mediator. Facilitation often involves a town board or a county commission doing a standard retreat. Mediation can be obviously around a hotter conflict where there's intra-board issues or board and issues with the neighborhood or other kinds of things like that. I'll stop there other than to add that, as you said, Michael, we go back a long ways to roughly the early 90s when you were at NF University, and I was starting 5 years of working for a state agency in Ohio called the Ohio Commission on Dispute Resolution and Conflict Management.
Yeah, well, we can reminisce about those days, but let's think about, let's move forward with our conversation as well, building on your extraordinary experience, as you say, as a pracademic, because what you bring is the kind of thoughtful analysis, the reliance on research, and the infusion of theory in your practice from the academic perspective, and then the skills of the practitioner to be able to engage with people either in mediation or facilitation. I wonder if you could talk a bit about some of your experiences and your thoughts about the nature of engagement with groups and how you build capacity within the group through stakeholder engagement to become so that you can do your job effectively by by having them work effectively with you.
Okay, thanks. I'll come back to the capacity part you included in the question. So typically, the kind of work it ranges from shorter phone calls where people are just figuring out if some kind of outside third-party mediator facilitator could be helpful. So luckily, I do not have a quota. So unlike other consultants who obviously want and need the business, the safety and the set of incentives for me at the university is not to go after every case or potential case. So it's trying to say, who are you looking for? How much could you do on your own? What would be features between the nature of the stakeholders, the issues, and the potential people you'd want to help them think through. So that's sort of a shorter piece, usually a phone call kind of thing, maybe an email exchange. When I am asked to actually do either a formal assessment or to be involved, then we go through what that scope of work would be. And since we are a school of government, our contract is with one part of government, typically, again, either an agency or the board and top administrator of a city or county in North Carolina, oftentimes for an annual priority setting kind of retreat, budget priorities, or sometimes they really have some hot topics where it fits more of my profile. At the same time, one of the key things we're careful about is not coming in to simply reinforce a majority's view. So it's unsurprising that oftentimes, like on a 5-member board, it could be a 3-2 split. And one of our values is saying, look, we are here to provide even-handed value for all board members. We're not just an arm of the current majority for where to go. And as with other, good practices in the field, we want to say, how have you thought about the total range of stakeholders? Yes, the elected board has certain powers and responsibilities, but if you're putting together certain things around a range of issues, leaders in the community, certain staff members may also need to have other roles. And that's what I find really good and interesting, trying to both do a good job, both effectively and ethically as a provider. But I think that touches on your point about potential capacity building. So
go right ahead, John.
Thinking about stakeholders has really been on my mind recently because within the government context, yes, you can identify, okay, here's the elected board, here are departments or particular people with responsibilities. But really, for some of the hardest issues, and at least the term of art these days are wicked problems, where it's not just one particular part of government or the community that's responsible. Anything from opioids to obviously racial equity. There's so many different pieces there. And I realize I think I can do better, both raising the questions with the officials that I work with and do my own expansion, because given our moment of late summer of 2020 and the whole array of protests following the George Floyd killing and many others, one has to always rush in and say it wasn't just one event that sparked it. How one thinks about this broad sense of community values and unrest and seeking change, where there may not be formal leaders, but there needs to be voice. There needs to be different kinds of forums or ways not just to say things, but to take at least some steps that are within people's powers that in general seem to be moving things forward. Because I'm especially feel an obligation to say, yes, your and my and a lot of our colleagues' work is about productive talk to get to action. but so much for marginalized and oppressed people and communities is saying, we've heard enough talk. We need something to show that you're serious, that change is happening in the right direction. And so that leads into other reflections I have about us as being prepared for those kind of deeper identity and community injustice kinds of assistance, and what my limitations are as an older, white, privileged male.
How do you manage that process? Because on the one hand, I suspect you've got a board or some governing entity who would, in a sense, like to keep the conversation fairly narrow and discreet within their, as they say, wheelhouse, something that they feel comfortable acting on, and to do it in a way that engenders the least controversy. Is that fair to say or am I stereotyping that group?
You're at a good starting point, because certainly, both for good reason and as a rationalization, one will say, is this my job or not? What can we do at this city level? We can't redo the whole housing for the community, but we do have responsibilities for police. So some of it would be where the right levers and responsibilities are. What I think is really the more challenging and essential part is that way of voice outside of going for a specific government action. And let me take this in a slightly different vignette. So earlier this summer, I was approached by a town manager saying, there's fighting among my elected board members. I think it's hurting our overall effectiveness for what we can do as staff. Can you come in as a mediator and have us work through things together? Very reasonable request. And I said, this is possible if I can talk with each of the people to see what they would want to talk about, how they would want to try to come together, and whether they think I or my institutional base at UNC Chapel Hill School of Government is going to be acceptable. Because I will not come in unless people want me to there, unless there is at least an open door, not saying we're going to reach agreement, but an open door to do that. So as I was touching base with some of the board members, one in particular was very skeptical, saying, I just don't know what we would be able to do at this point. And confidentially, he went through his views of what had happened and the sense of a lack of trust and a big question of why now. He could see that as perhaps nefarious kinds of purposes that would not fit what he thinks is best for the town. And so I said, I'm not coming in unless everyone says yes. And so I reported that back to the city manager, and the city manager, with some understandable frustration, would say, well, does it really have to stop just because one person says no or is uncertain at this point? And I said, well, given what I think both will be effective and how we approach things at the School of Government, it has to be everyone pulling the oar in some degree or not. So that at least was another way that highlighted for me that there is that value for taking the time and seeing what it would take for people to, again, in our parlance, what would it take to get to the table? And even more difficult now, given COVID restrictions, of what the table would look like and the degree of comfort and effectiveness doing it through video screens rather than having what I still consider the higher level of communication, even if you're wearing a mask, at some kind of distance so you can read body language and other things like that.
And important for you as that body language aspect, important for everybody, especially for you as the mediator or facilitator, but also for the participants.
That's correct. And talking through what kinds of expectations or ground rules and how certain, as you know, how you would even name certain topics or issues, because we know that naming can be seen as presenting biases from the start.
Right. And I want to comment or ask a question. Your department, is it your department's policy? Is it your individual policy that I don't go in unless there's agreement from everyone to invite me to see what could happen without any commitment as to what would happen, but just the invitation to you? It has to be, that invitation card has to be signed by everybody.
Well, yes. So my decision in that case and others stems from our School of Government broad values. So unlike other kinds of university-based think tanks or special departments or schools on government that do our own studies of policies and say, here's what should happen, we follow 3 values. One is responsiveness, that we do want to be provide information, knowledge, teaching, writing, whatever it may be, in a way that seems to match what people are asking for. But the 2 broader ones that certainly fit me as a third party are being nonpartisan and non-advocacy. So as I mentioned on the non-advocacy, we don't go and study gun control and come up with our own opinions. On the other hand, people will come to issues with us and say, we want to think this through better. And we say, fine, let's talk about how we could do that. But our scope typically is, here are the pros, here are the cons, here's what other people have done. It's your decision. We will not take a position on that. And so, at least for my sense of being nonpartisan, again, some cities or counties, most of the North Carolina cities do not have people run by party label. At the county level, they do. Certainly at state representatives, they do. But even without that, if I were to try to get in where one person is at best on the fence and maybe opposing it, what does that say? It seems like, again, I'm working for everyone else and not respecting that person's interests. Now, it does come back to my need to be creative and be a good listener and think through various things to see how they may not see overlap that could allow me to come in, but I do, or at least I propose something in a way that tries to respect those different viewpoints so people feel, again, I am working in an even-handed fashion. As you can tell, I'm trying to stay away from neutral, and the term that I like to introduce when I teach mediation, which I do in a short course for the Masters of Public Administration MPA program, I borrow it and actually show them the short video from Chris Moore. Multi-partial is a nice way to think about it as well.
Well, especially in situations like that, you know, you're talking about, it's that word multi-partial, when you're working with even a core group of 5, 6, 7, 8 people is critical. It also seems to me, John, that there's an ethical dimension to what you've talked about in terms of wanting a unanimous invitation to engage. And is that part of your thinking as well, that it, from an ethical perspective?
Yes, and I'm glad you raised that, because on a parallel track, again, I don't see a direct conflict, but one has to keep an eye on it. About 3 years ago, I was introduced to a different model of strategic planning that is sort of trademarked and called strategic doing. And very briefly, without getting into all the pieces, the general thrust of it was, if you find sufficient stakeholders who can influence enough of, again, it was often around issues of community revitalization, economic development, and so more narrowly problem focused. As long as it's a mixture from business, from government, from civic, from religious, maybe you don't wait for everyone to get involved to say, here's how we see what our community needs, here's the resources we can collaborate on, and we can at least start taking these steps. And what was appealing to me about that was, it's not excluding stakeholders, but is trying to show this group can get something done. And they always leave the door open and recognize they're not the whole bailiwick, that as long as other people are open and they want more people to come in, that's fine. But that balances off what we were just talking about. Does nothing happen until every potential stakeholder is on board to try to do something. Now, I think that's different from obviously the example I gave of a split between an elected board in a city and our school of government and my own ethics that say I'm here to try to provide productive assistance for everyone who would be on that board. And if someone remains on the fence and says this doesn't seem the right time or the right way to go about it, I'm not going to go into that. Again, we'll talk through with anyone confidentially about how they see things, what it may take. As you and I both know, sometimes you need something smaller, one or two maybe confidence building steps, borrowing a term from diplomacy, to see if there then gets to the point where, okay, I see enough change of past behavior that gave me the mistrust or the alienation. Maybe I'm willing to try something under a limited basis.
So if you take a situation where you've got a board divided, and let's say that the issue that the manager was, the town manager was asking you to come in to deal with, that one of the main issues that the board was continually at odds over was one that had stakeholders within the community, organizations or loosely formed groups that were defined enough so that you could say it was a group, but it might not be an established organization. How do you work in those kinds of situations with the other stakeholders in the community?
That is an interesting challenge, and let me answer in a slightly different way. Usually, again, the split on the board, when I've been asked to come in, have been pretty clear to me that even if obviously these folks are elected, they're in the community, they have connections to a variety of individuals and other folks. And so I have not had in that example to move from a split board and the elected members and then invite in others. And I'll come back to that in a second. The other piece has been, how do you have effective mixtures of public meetings, smaller work groups around a bigger issue, such as Chapel Hill, of course, is the hometown for the UNC flagship campus where I'm a member. And they had several years ago be part of a longer term strategic planning process. And so I was part of a team that was specifically aimed at not just identified groups, but other ways to both do surveys and have public meetings for face-to-face, large group and small group things. And so that's more of the examples I have in my School of Government work tied into those pieces. Let me, though, continue on that, going back to what I mentioned about the United Methodist Church. So what was especially important for them was not just putting together people who are known to the denomination to have particular views that contrast with one another on what church policies should be. Because again, this was the 90s and the early zeros. So it was a very earlier time before gay marriage at the federal level and other pieces like that. And so what I found interesting and both worked for them and worked for me was like a 5-person invitation committee, such that people would even see on that list of names, oh, if they can get those people together even to organize this, then I'm willing to come to that. So I think that's one key piece, is one, going back to the broader stakeholder question, is who is seen as having authentic legitimacy for being able to reflect those different views that would need to have some degree of would need to have a direct degree of voice and influence for any kind of really potential collaboration or consensus on a really difficult issue.
So yeah, maybe I'm confusing the two, and in my question wasn't helpful, because in some instances you're brought in as the 3-2 board split you describe to act almost like a mediator to help resolve one or more specific disputes. And then there are times when you're brought in because there is a public policy issue that
Yes.
requires a broader engagement within whatever one might define as the community. In case of the university, it's the primary community is the university, but also it touches so many other people within the city of Chapel Hill and the state government and so on.
Correct. So there was one example of this, and I'm sure others have encountered this, when you may want to think about co-mediation or co-facilitation on a few dimensions. One would be certainly different kinds of skills or strengths that people have, and thus having a better team rather than a solo. Secondly, as we've all thought about at least and wrestle with in different ways, when we believe that identities and the values tied to them about race and ethnicity or gender or class seem to be very prominent, how might the mediation or facilitation team be seen as a better reflection of what we're trying to do there? And so as an example, there was a county near to the university, not the home county for UNC Chapel Hill, but nearby. And they wanted to have a facilitation around an appointed citizens group by the county commission to look at how county commissioners are elected in this county. And this county certainly has a very strongly conservative section and a more mixed section, because the metro area of Raleigh and of Chapel Hill is sort of bringing in new people to that county. And so when I heard about that, and they said they wanted me to go move forward with that, I said, I'm not sure everybody there, whoever they would be appointed, would not see me tied to the University of Chapel Hill and the effects of the employment and commuting of people from Chatham County into Chapel Hill as being neutral. So I approached a colleague in another part of the state, well away from this area, who I knew was a good facilitator, who had community facilitation experience and was not tied to a university, and specifically Chapel Hill, and said, let's see if we can put this together, because I think that's important, both for our perspectives, but how people would look at us and conceive that this would be a balanced, or at least my bias would not dominate if for whatever they would perceive, given my tie to the university.
It's extraordinary, John, as I listen to you. I think that many people imagine that what a facilitator does when they go into a meeting is somebody calls, says, look, we're having a meeting. We want you to come and just run the meeting for us. And the person grabs their briefcase, hops in the vehicle or whatever, or they're on their bicycle, and goes and just runs the meeting. And what you're describing is a level of thought and analysis and planning in order to help the parties achieve the result that they want to achieve. That's meticulous.
Well, thank you. And let me pick up on a very early part. Remember, you said capacity building, and I paused on that because that is some of the point. It's, again, the old adage, do you give someone a fish for a day or teach them how to fish? And so we have had through the School of Government, a little less so with me and more with some of my colleagues, saying, sure, we can work with you and plan and show a good system for thinking about how facilitation fits. But of course, we want you to have the skills yourself. So that has ranged from, again, that kind of developmental facilitation kind of engagement, where we say, sure, we'll work with you with X, Y, and Z up to this point, but it is really to achieve liftoff or for you to achieve a sense of skills and confidence to do it for yourself. And then secondly, one of my great enjoyments has been doing through the Masters of Public Administration program a short course, not a full semester, but the equivalent of about a half of a semester, but much more in a training environment of a full weekend, a Friday and a Saturday, plus advanced work and follow-up work, where again, trying to give them intensive experience, both working from my favorite book, again, because it has such great diagrams, comes from Community at Work out in San Francisco, and the lead author is a gentleman named Sam Kaner, K-A-N-E-R, such to the point where I worked with them to also create an online module, a segment on consensus. Because what I find is people say they want everybody to agree, but there are gradients of agreement, and you need to be clear about sort of what gets you over the line, where how enthusiastic or how much do people have to be supportive to say, yes, we have consensus. I have taught about that because I think people abuse that term. They say, 8 out of 9 is consensus, or 10 out of 12 is consensus. And Congress, cutting deals. Well, we've reached a consensus. Well, we've reached a compromise. It's not a consensus. And so I tend to be a purist on that because there is that power if, again, it's also this kind of assessment, if the people making the decision are the same people expected to implement the decision, you really do want to have as much people on board as possible, understanding that there are going to be some trade-offs and compromises in whatever package may come out of that.
But there's a difference, isn't there? And I think this is what you're talking about. There's a difference between somebody accepting a plan and somebody buying into the plan.
Correct.
And that's
Absolutely.
one of the elements of consensus, is that you don't just say, okay, well, if that's what you want to do, you go ahead and do it.
Right. The difference between I won't stand in the way versus I'll do my part, or how do we all work together to make this happen? Or, and this is where it becomes a delightful way where I think third-party facilitators really add value by saying, okay, if there are some people who aren't enthusiastic, let's listen carefully to why that is. But more importantly, it may be they just don't think it's going to work. So let's get clear on what is the short-term period where we're going to test this to see if this policy or initiative or whatever is doing what we think it will do, such that these skeptics either are convinced or everybody has to rethink this strategy. And so again, skepticism or not being on board, it's at least reflecting that can have value, how we all, assuming that everyone at least is online for the mission of the general initiative or the group or whatever, the mechanics and the particular implementation to achievement steps are worth really digging into.
Yeah. When you talk about consensus with the group, is it their perception of consensus that you want to adopt, or do you individually or your department have your own sort of values and beliefs about consensus that you teach and hope that the group will adopt? How does that work?
It's not the latter. We do not have a matter of saying consensus is always good under these circumstances. It is more a matter of what is the pros and cons of consensus, as being the obvious one that one person saying no means no consensus, and what does that mean? But both from the book I mentioned and from some other simpler ones, which is, okay, where are you on this? Are you a one? Boy, I'm on board, I'm ready to get going, down to sort of hanging out, could we have some more conversation, to 5 saying I won't stand in the way, but I'm really not on board. And my favorite is then the fist. No, I am against this. I can't get on this. So, fingers 1 to 5 and fist is one. The one I like even better, which is a quick visual, is using colored index cards, green, yellow, and red, because sort of the standard traffic signal is something people can relate to. So greens and yellows can give you a good idea of where things are in terms of relative support.
And you use that not just as an end result, but you use that incrementally, right?
Yes, absolutely. My favorite metaphor is we're baking a cake, and this is like putting the toothpick into the cake. We're just seeing, is it done yet? It's not who's right or wrong or who's in the majority or minority. We all are baking this cake together.
Yeah, and some people use the metaphor of taking the temperature of the room.
Yes, just
Right.
another good one.
Yeah, yeah. So when it's really interesting when you talk about the work that you do to think about your values, pardon me, your beliefs. How do you both project them in an honest and ethical and authentic way? And when do you have to compartmentalize in order to be multi-partial, to be balanced in how you approach folks? What's that process like for you?
Okay, well, values obviously can be a really big area in terms of my values, facilitator values. I'll start, and then you can see where you may want to go. The main value, not a main value, self-determination. And again, I know this comes from a lot of different ethical pieces formulated in codes of ethics in our field of dispute resolution and consensus building. So that means informed participation. It means fair and balanced, and people literally being able to have the voice they need. Not everyone will speak as long as one another, but really making sure that people have a chance to participate. As we do also in teaching, sometimes that means, if you have a group of 12, sometimes having subgroups for more intense discussions and 3 or 4 where people are more comfortable doing that. So those kinds of techniques. I fall back on, I hope rightly, I hope not as a rationalization, as we talked about earlier, I've been seen as at least acceptable to everybody in this particular group from the beginning. And so as long as I try to reinforce that, the question though is, do I really give people opportunities, sometimes offline, to give me a critique or say, no, I'm not sure this is working. I think I can always do a better job on that for people for me to be as conscientious as possible about whether I am getting the intended effect of multi-partialness. At the same time, I want to have people have a sense of good exchanges. I won't say equal exchanges, but at least more of an equal footing in the room, but I don't change power dynamics outside of the room. And so sometimes, especially if you're getting into a workplace situation, even if it is coworkers from different departments, there could be other ways that one could have power over the other, let alone, supervisors and direct reports, which tends not to be my area in general, but having to think about both the ground rules and different ways to manage that, but also recognizing I am not in the explicit business of power balancing outside of the ground rules and the topics in the discussion. So that's a limit. That's why, again, working and tying into government means being influenced by those power structures, which often can mean promoting more of the status quo and less change. So that is something I reflect on. I guess I've made my peace so far with that. But as I mentioned at the very beginning with George Floyd and so many other things that are important for the big picture for peacemaking in our communities, it's back on the front burner for me.
And so that's what there are 2 things that I wanted to ask about in terms of this. One is you have your own beliefs and your own values, for example, with respect to racial equity. And someone asks you to come in and facilitate, to help manage a dialogue, a conversation. or as you did with the Methodist Church, supporting them in their conversation about gay marriage. And you may have had your own values about whether gay marriage is appropriate under certain, either personally to you or under certain religious principles, or you may have, but how do you manage process when you may have strong feelings, when you may feel a certain way about justice or fairness with respect to a particular issue?
Thank you for bringing that up, because some of our colleagues, as you probably know, have a recent publication around that. Where can, quote unquote, third parties still work for justice, be seen even as more on the advocate side under certain circumstances. Going back to the Methodist work, it was a challenge. And for me, what helped was, going back to my research for my degree, I had interviewed people from different sides, and again, both worked on my listening skills and tried to show that I was genuinely trying to capture each person's truths for how they see their Methodist identity, their theology, and how that translates to their views about gay and lesbians in the church, what the roles are. And what helped me try to balance that out was the invitation group I mentioned earlier, how we would frame the agenda, how we would frame how people would be invited in, how the process would go. That's a check on me in terms of making sure that it's seen as even-handed and multi-partial that way. The final thing that I do, especially since I'm in government, I work very hard at making sure I am exposed to different views. We know these days, especially I can see my son is really sort of getting on my chin here. Let's see if we can switch that a little bit. Anyway, let me come up a little bit. It's not getting any better, Michael. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm going to switch this a little bit because I'm just a little distracted. Okay, little sunspots aren't so bad. Anyway, so I go on the Fox News website. Until for a while I was listening to Rush Limbaugh. Those are very different views than where I am typically, but I use that as an example of sort of flexing my ideological muscles in a different way. That if we only see things that are easy to digest and reinforce our values, that's what we need often, but especially for our third-party roles, we need to flex those diversity of viewpoints, messages, and being able to digest them and look at the underlying values there, some of which indeed may have different overlaps in small ways, but obviously great divergences in others.
And you know, John, I think there's a step I wonder if there's a step that's precedent to what you just described, which is the belief that the only way that you can be multi-partial in this respect is to recognize your own limitations and not assume that you can easily compartmentalize. Here's me as the individual, I've got my own beliefs, my own life, my own values, and here's me as the professional functioning, right? So I'm wondering, do you think that that comes first, that we have to recognize that there is the potential for us really and genuinely and honestly to be biased in order then to manage that in a way that doesn't interfere with our work?
Correct. And to build on that and to have the ethics to say, no, I am at too much of a risk to do that. And this gets, I think, even harder, whereas through both my colleagues at the school and more broadly, the implicit bias, whether it's the online Harvard test and other pieces like that. It is good for awareness, but then you have to really ask yourself, is that enough? Is that going to really, what are my other tools? Because awareness may not be enough, especially given how deep some of those biases may be. And on the other hand, I sometimes, when I teach mediation, I make a joke out of it, but a joke with a point to say, I don't know if a student looking at me says, you know, that's sort of like my Uncle Earl. He was redhead, he was losing his hair early, and he always pontificated just like this professor. That, you know, we all don't know what's going on in our unconscious and how that can affect us, especially as mediators and facilitators. That's why I think ideally getting at least someone else with you, because regardless of exactly what kinds of diversity you may exhibit by the standard visuals of gender, ethnicity, and other pieces, just getting someone with different life experiences will help pick up on things that you would miss, or that you would interpret one way when there are multiple interpretations.
So what I've appreciated about all of your about all of the things you've said is that there is an underlying ethic that applies to this, that you can describe, and you have the practices, the things that you do, but what also comes through is that at the foundation you want to act, you, John Stevens, want to act as an ethical human being, as an ethical practitioner, and the actions flow from that.
Correct. And one has to acknowledge any particular process, move, or technique of mediation or facilitation could benefit explicitly or implicitly one stakeholder over another. Let me offer this one really interesting vignette, not related to my work, but listening to a podcast about someone who has a significant stutter, to the point where they were, again, this was a story in a public space where there were very long silences. And it just really drove home to me, for most of our work, we expect a certain kind of cadence and what's seen as responsiveness. And many other people, I think, are better than this than me about really sitting with silence. But it is, in so many of at least my circles, countercultural and can feel uncomfortable. But it just shows how much privilege we give to the more verbally skilled. And so that's, again, another way of hitting me upside the head about saying, hold on here. I really haven't thought about that, and I need to really consider that much more. I do some of that in terms of saying, look, some people are more talkative, less talkative, and as you know, Michael, various tools for silent writing or a pause in a discussion, and then making sure that quieter people feel they have the opportunity to speak. But I think I still have a ways to go on that.
Do you ever, you know, I mentioned at the outset this note, and you came back to it a bit, about capacity building. And that, do you ever find yourself in a situation, not that you're trying to adjust the power dynamic, but you're trying to help each person who's participating be at their best? Do you ever take somebody aside and say, and sort of help them not think through what their position is, what they believe, what their ideas are, but rather how to communicate it in a way that's authentic for them and more helpful to the process?
I cannot recall a specific instance of that. What comes closer to that was being a mediator for a divided town board and having to navigate what is appropriate, of course, called open meetings. And so North Carolina and many other laws say, look, anytime you have a majority of the board, if they're doing business, it should be only when there's notification and a meeting that anybody in the public can come to. As we both know, oftentimes in mediation, the sense of privacy in caucuses has its value. People don't want to be in the fishbowl all the time. And so with this 5-person board, consulting their town attorney and my own colleagues who are also expert in this area, in an open session at one of the regular meetings saying, we are going to have this mediation. Here's how it's going to work. There can be no decisions made in this mediation, and I'll tell you why in a second. If anything comes out of it, we would only discuss it and decide with the public's open meetings standards. So what that meant was, with a 5-member board, with different combinations, it could only be me and 2 board members at a time in the room. And then we had different sessions around that. Now, I will admit, some people will say, boy, you're really just skirting around that law. And I can take that criticism. But because it wasn't decision-making in those sessions, that's what I fall back on. And as we both know, the need for people to be vulnerable, to be able to say their piece and not have it up on social media immediately. So that's the closest I would come to your example. I can't remember any specific coaching or listening and any kinds of suggestions about how they communicated, but that's the closest I can come to.
What caused me to ask that, or to come back to it, John, was your comment about how you would manage meetings in terms of activities, behavior that would allow for the possibility that people will communicate differently. And so you're acknowledging, you're not giving them greater power, you're just simply recognizing that this individual or this group is going to be much better able to say what they need to say for their own benefit and the benefit of the group if X happens, if we allow for silence, if we do some quiet reflection, if we do some writing exercises, if. And that's what I was getting at. So it is that you do some sort of capacity support, I guess, not capacity building.
Yeah, yes, I'd say so. Again, the more capacity building I see is the more traditional teaching. So I mentioned the MPA course, and for another set of colleagues at the School of Government, we sort of look at public leadership and governance broadly, and so that ranges from supervisory skills up to expectations of elected boards and other pieces. And so we have a whole set of skill building workshops. We're obviously doing one more often on working with groups in remote settings, given the COVID restrictions these days. But I was just working with a colleague on facilitation skills in a one-day workshop. But the way we are thinking about this one-day workshop is taking particular topics, doing short recorded lectures or even demonstrations that people can see before we have the more live on session. So how you adapt to where we are more remotely in our communications or online communications. And I have to say, one has to be careful about terminology. Remote even, has a certain valence right. that online or distributed or distance may mean something else. So I think we're all sort of navigating that at least.
And so you're both, it's interesting, John, you're thinking about how you teach, but how you teach people to help run their own meetings. So
yes.
Which they will end up doing through one video conferencing software or another.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's, again, I have wonderful colleagues, and from early on, we said, look, we can't have it all about the technology. No. We have to recognize the different technologies, but then take fairly standard and generic and useful facilitation skills and think about how they adapt to the online environment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at the way you and I are communicating. If we were sitting in the same room, we'd be able to see much more of one another and pick up all sorts of cues and information that would enrich our conversation. But here, you and I mean, the best we can see is from our shoulders to our head to our shoulder, to our chest. And in both our cases, we tend to be people who use our hands. So
yes, indeed.
we can see that much, but there are many people who don't. And so the technology has both a benefit and a limitation.
Yeah, as hard as it is, at least for me, because I put that value on the literally in the room kind of stuff, to the extent that people can have sufficient internet connections and technology savvy, we do have to look at this as an opportunity for people where travel and time getting to and from a location was the barrier that we sort of worked around, or frankly sort of overlooked, because we thought it was so important to have people physically together. And now we do have to look at some of the potential positives of this as well as its limitations.
Yeah. John, we're getting near the end of our time, and I'm wondering if there are other items that you wanted to, we've got a few more minutes. Was there something that you wish I had asked, or something that you want to go back and embellish, or a new thought that you had that you wanted to share?
Wow, thanks for opening up a whole new door, potentially. Let me just put it this way. I'll take it to another project that's right at the top of my list. So I've mentioned to you previously that similar to this kind of interview, but in a shorter format, I had the very good opportunity around an online course I'll teach for the first time, fall 2020, is on ombuds and mediation for our Masters of Public Administration program. Our MPA program does have a set of students on campus who typically go through the program in 2 years full time. But over the last 8 years, we added a parallel track for people who can't come to UNC but want to do the degree strictly through online. And so I'm teaching for those students. And so what has been good for me, especially thinking of what I wanted to do on mediation, was I have certainly a preferred model that I use. I call it facilitator mediation, and I think that's common in the field. But I thought carefully and said, there are other models that we know of, and even if students may find them odd or different, I need to expose them to that. So at least a second model with demonstration videos from other sources, evaluative mediation. Obviously, many kinds closer to labor management negotiations, small claims, and other court-based programs where the mediator is much more active in saying, if you don't agree, what do you think will happen? Or if you move in this direction, here's where I think the courts will or won't come out. And then finally, the third model was narrative mediation. And I have to say, I've not practiced as an evaluative mediator, as everything you've heard, facilitative mediation, given my base at the School of Government and our values are really, that's my mainstream. And I really had to think, students need to know their flavors or models or emphases of different kinds of mediation, because what I really was happy to get more awareness of narrative mediation is that mix of therapeutic and narratives and cultural norms and roles that people play or actually are forced into. And I think that really does play out well in a number of government situations for our MPA program. So getting my own exposure, like you, to various colleagues in the field who practice differently than me, helping think through how to present that to students, that's been a really both challenge but an invigorating opportunity for me. I can't say how it's turned out yet. I haven't even taught my first course. First session, I'll be finishing in late November, and then we'll see how it looks from there, and I'll have a chance to revise the course after that.
And you know, this is one of the, you know, you spoke about so many of the advantages you have as a pracademic. And here's another one, because when people take a mediation course ordinarily, from a practitioner like myself or the hundreds of others who are out there, they get only one version. This is what mediation is. And through your program, you can show your students that mediation comes in different flavors and that there are underlying sets of beliefs that shape how the practice is carried out. What a remarkable opportunity.
The final piece, which again, I hope will turn out as I envision, but who knows, it could be a flop, is the last part of the course after they've had an exposure. Ombudsing, of course, is harder to quote unquote show than mediation, but I have several interviews and of course readings and things like that. And so the last segment, again, many of these people are already in a nonprofit or government and doing their work. And so I've created space to say, okay, you've seen these forms of mediation, you've seen what ombudsing does, and I even do a little bit on dispute system design. Mm-hmm. And their last assignment is saying, okay, either come up with your own scenario where you would use mediation skills, even if you're not a formal mediator, where we can play this out in class so you can get something that's really relevant to your situation. Or the other option is, wow, I see this recurring sense of grievance, of problems, of sticking points, and it may not need an ombuds, but we need to tweak our system of how we even think about and address certain kinds of disputes. I'm going to propose a new, at least a system design change, and they'll get feedback from me and the other students. So obviously, pracademic, I want to make sure it is as tightly tied, but they have to really put a lot into this to say, how is this going to be relevant to me, and be willing to get the feedback before they finish that assignment and get graded on it.
And that's another, you know, thing that I think is that you're doing that is unique and wonderful. And that is that although some of the teaching that you do has to be sort of generic in the sense that it applies to every student in the class. You do one lecture about narrative mediation, or you provide a set of materials about narrative or facilitative or evaluative. But then each of them gets to think about how they would put what they've learned into practice. And that's a remarkable, so that they both have the theory and they have an understanding about how the theory actually works in a practical circumstance.
Correct.
Fantastic. John, this has been a treat to see and talk to you again, to have the conversation that we did today. Thanks so very much for talking with me today.
And thank you for this wonderful opportunity. I really appreciate it, Michael.